Hi, folks. Welcome to our weekly chat. Thanks for joining me again. And thanks for some great comments. I've been getting some good feedback and some really good questions. This week, I want to talk about something that came up in a conversation I had with somebody, and they didn't even know it had come up. I was thinking about it. But this idea of what we call nostalgia. And I was watching actually a video interview with the historian John Meacham the other day, and it was from a while ago, and one of the questions was about nostalgia, and he was, saying that it's a very powerful thing in our minds. Well, one of the things I did was look up I know what nostalgia is. We all kind of do, but I wanted to make sure, so I looked up the definition. It's a wistful longing for the past, or a wistful memory of the past. Or affection. One of the definitions is wistful affection for the past. And what happens sometimes is we get this idea, and this is what John Meacham was talking about, is um, where we look back, and especially when we look back on with movies, historical fiction novels sometimes, where we'll think of the good things and we'll forget about some of the not so good things, and it kind of taints our view of history. So we get into our heads these ideas that certain eras were really good eras, and other eras were not so good, and we forget to put events from the past in context. And one of the examples he was pointing out is that we often get this view that, for instance, Abraham Lincoln, we look at him as a really popular president, that did great things, freed the enslaved people, which we talked about a few weeks ago. It's not exactly true. He worked toward the 13th Amendment, Emancipation Proclamation. He signed that, which didn't free enslaved people in the United States. The 13th Amendment did. Uh, but we look back on Abraham Lincoln with a nostalgic view in many cases, and we forget that he wasn't as popular at the time that we think today. We won the Civil War, and he kept the Union together, so he gets this reputation after the fact that he was a great president, and he certainly was probably one of our best presidents for keeping the Union together. However, at the time, he did some very controversial things, including, he took some wartime measures that were very controversial, uh, imprisoning people without charges in order to prevent an enemy infiltration. So he did that, suspended habeas corpus. Um, and he also wasn't, folks didn't think he might win the second election. So he was elected in 1860, and then in 1864, um, they had an election in the middle of the Civil War, and there was a large chunk of the country who was not keen on being in the war and didn't necessarily agree with it, and that includes the Union side that was still able to vote, that hadn't seceded. So we get this idea in our head that everybody in the North supported Abraham Lincoln and supported the Union, and keeping the country together. There were lots of people who felt that the South could just go, whether that would have worked or not. Um, but we have this nostalgic idea of Abraham Lincoln in that time period sometimes. So anyway, that's the sort of thing that nostalgia brings up, and I got to thinking about how it really does influence how we think about local history. Um, and John Meacham also talked about there was the election. Um, FDR is a perfect example. We look back on Franklin Roosevelt as a great president, but he wasn't like 90% to 10% popular. Uh, Actually, the election of and I had it up here, and the election of 1932. We have, of course, had the um, stock market crash, and the economy tanked in 1929, and we were in the Great Depression, and FDR was running against Herbert Hoover, and a lot of people look back today at FDR and the New Deal as saving the country from the depths of depression, and that thank goodness Franklin Roosevelt came along, and that everybody supported Herbert Hoover. Couldn't get out of, we couldn't get him out of the White House fast enough, and that FDR saved the country, and that everybody was behind him. Well, in fact, the election of 1932, yeah, FDR had a landslide in the Electoral College, but 472 to 59. But when you look at the popular vote, it was 57 and change percent to 39%. So nearly 40% of the country still supported Herbert Hoover. So we look back on, again, with nostalgia for sometimes, and think that the country was all supporting FDR because we look back on him as a popular president today. But many of his proposals and his policies, the New Deal, were called socialist, and folks were not supportive of it. And so we look back on it today and think, oh, well, Social Security is something we take for granted today. But there were people who did not support it, and a big chunk of the country did not support it. So we look back at our that time period with a nostalgic lens. So I got to thinking with these sorts of things, because one of the things John Meacham, the historian that I had mentioned where I was listening about this, had mentioned that people today think we have never been divided as a country more than we are today. Yeah, we're going through some pretty interesting times. The former president of the United States being indicted 4 times. That's an unprecedented thing. But the divide in the country, yeah, we have social media, and maybe it's a little harsher than we are used to in the recent past. But if you look back at the actual history of things, we have been divided before. But again, because we're looking back with nostalgia, we sometimes don't see it that way. The country was divided in 1932. The country was divided. Presidential elections have been close. There generally is there is a truth to the fact that there's probably a 60-40, and it goes one way or the other, and sometimes it's even closer. We don't always get the 1984 Ronald Reagan elections where it's a true landslide. But even then, the Electoral College, yeah, he had a landslide there, but there was a chunk of the country that did not support him. So if you really delve into the history of it and actually look at the numbers, they're different than sometimes what we remember in our head. So the other day I was talking to somebody, maybe it was a couple weeks ago, and someone was talking about World War II and how today we seem to all be against each other. Either you're on the Republican side or Democrat side, liberal or conservative, and that you're either one or the other, and the other side's the enemy. And I actually had found an article from the 1800s about an election, and they referred to the opposite side as the enemy. So that term has been happening for a while. So this feeling that we have today, where we're seeing the tribalism, where we're in our own corners, so to speak, I'll talk about that in a second, where we feel that way, it's not new. This has been happening through history. And in fact, a lot I like to talk about is the folks that are in the middle, not necessarily independents. They get lumped into like a third party feeling, but there's a whole group of folks that are more in the middle, and throughout history they've been there, and they actually determine the elections. So you'll hear about this in the presidential elections coming up, where they have the Republicans have the far right, the Democrats have the far liberal corner. It's those people in the middle that they're trying to get in the general election for House, Senate, and the presidency, not just the presidency. We tend to focus on that race quite a bit. But there's a whole group, and that has happened throughout history. So we forget sometimes when we look at those electoral maps from history, we look back as blue and red today in those terms. But there's a whole group, and it's a lot more complicated, a group in the middle. Or that is not necessarily far right or far left. It's the group in the middle, and that's who you have to study. And that's who I like to study, is where those folks are, where they go. when it comes to the time period in elections. So someone was talking about that the other day about how wouldn't it be great, they looked back with nostalgia on World War II. Remember World War II? And I don't, but I know a few people who are still around who do. But the idea in the head is that back in World War II, they said to me, well, back then when everybody rallied around each other and we supported the war effort, and we all rationed here at home. So if you even weren't serving or you didn't have a family member serving in the military during World War II, you would there would be rationing. You would volunteer for the Red Cross. You would volunteer to be a plane spotter. There would be lots of things that people did to support the war effort, and everybody rallied. And they looked back. This person was talking to me. I said, wouldn't it be great if we all could do that again, and we could all be, working together for a common cause and not have this bitter partisan rivalry. That's definitely nostalgia, looking back on World War II that way. Yes, there was a huge effort on the home front, and a lot of people did volunteer, but there was also a huge split. Not everyone supported the World War II effort. In fact, there's a great, and I say great because it's a great historical document, I would say, a source of information. But there was this great editorial cartoon on the front page of the East Aurora Advertiser back in 1942. And the cartoon has this government official who is trying to keep the war effort afloat, trying to order submarines, have a navy, bombers, tanks. And he has this woman standing at his desk, and I'll post it in the comments if you're watching on Facebook, but he has this woman standing at the desk, and it says, "Some of us," and she's just complaining about, I don't have enough sugar, and I don't have tires, and I need a new refrigerator, and all this. And there was an article in the paper, there were articles and articles in the paper about how people weren't stepping up. We have this idea where we think that everybody stepped up during World War II to help, and in fact, that's not the case. There were several people who didn't support the war, and there were several people who didn't ration. It was actually a legal rationing was put in place, and it was mandatory, but it also relied a lot on self-reporting, and a lot of people, you would go register for your sugar ration coupons, and you would have to report how much sugar you already had in your house. Well, they didn't necessarily have people going into your house to find out, but they thought, everybody was going to be patriotic and report how much sugar they had, and that wasn't true. And there were articles in the Advertiser that said that. So yeah, a lot of folks did step up and support the war effort, but there were a lot of people who didn't. And there were actually reports in the newspapers of folks who felt that it was the government could not tell them what to do. This sounds familiar, right? With more recent years, with the government and health regulations during COVID. There were people who were saying the government can't tell me how much sugar I can buy. And this happened during World War II, and it's documented in the newspaper. So this idea of that everybody supported the war effort, and you can even see that if you look in the voting statistics. Not everybody voted for the candidates, the presidential candidates. FDR did not get 100% support. He actually had a big chunk of folks who did not support his presidency, and the Republican Party hit him hard during his presidency. So we get this nostalgic view of what was happening because he was reelected several times, and he was the leader of the country during World War II, and we were on the winning end of World War II. There was a whole group of folks, a big chunk of our country and our local people, so right here in our local communities, that didn't support the war effort. And you can see that just by looking at the newspaper reports, which is quite interesting. So that one editorial cartoon kind of summed it all up for me when I was doing research about this. Was, not everybody supported the war effort, which I didn't even think about, because we think of that, oh yeah, back in World War II, our grandparents' generation, for many of us, some of us for our parents, they knew how to support the country and rally around the war, and we just don't know how to do that today, and that is not true. We're probably the idea of the good old days is the same. Human nature is very similar to what it was, but because we look back with nostalgic lenses on our glasses to history, we don't see some of the things that were happening at the time. And then another thing, speaking of World War II, another story I really like that tells, basically gives this idea that we haven't changed much, and that the good old days are also today, and that not all times during history are good old days. Was here locally, I often hear people complain about teenagers and young adults and how they're lazy and don't want to work, and that's simply not true. That we adults today often compare the young adults and kids to themselves or their parents and say that they're not working as hard as we did or our parents did. Every generation thinks that about the next generation. It's just true. And a great example is this article from 1941 that was in the East Aurora Advertiser, and a woman here in town named Rebecca Persons. She was, I think, in her 90s actually. She was old, older, and she had lived a long life. And they had done an interview with her in the newspaper, and one of the things they asked her about were kids and young adults, and she had said that she thought that many of them were spoiled, and she said children are having too many luxuries without having to earn them, and she complained about skirts being too short, that you could see the ankles of girls walking down the street. But she was saying that the radio and the advent of all these things had made children spoiled, and then they didn't have to work as much as that of her generation. And this was in 1941. And then it dawned on me, she's talking about what we call today the greatest generation. So she's talking about the greatest generation being spoiled, many of them, and not having to work as much as their parents did. And I thought, oh, this is the same refrain, one generation to the next to the next. And so we look back on nostalgia, 1940s, that these people, that adults thought of kids, that they were, that we think that they were hardworking, and that the generations today are just don't work as hard as they did in the past, and that's not true. You'll always have members of a generation who are not as motivated as the others. And I can give you several examples of members of the young generation today who are doing great things. And so I often get concerned and annoyed, frankly, when people say, "Oh, kids today, they're not willing to work hard and they're lazy." That's not true. And in fact, adults were saying that about the next generation below them for years and years and years, for decades. And they're even saying that about the greatest generation. So it's being said about every generation. It doesn't necessarily make it true. So one of those things where if you look back with nostalgia, you don't get an accurate view of what was actually happening. So how do we, and one of the things I was saying, how do we avoid this nostalgia idea? And it's okay to look back with nostalgia. If you're reading a book and someone looks back with nostalgia, perhaps. But one of the things I like to do is to put things in context. Is when something happened, an event happened or something, I just try to grab the newspaper from that week. You can go into newspaper archives and you're looking back at an event and read the newspaper as if, and you can do a lot of this online. There's a lot of the Buffalo newspapers or newspapers in your own communities if you're not here, where you can just read the paper, not just the paper, not just the article about the event, or if you're looking up a family obituary or something, read the rest of the paper to put it in context. What was going on at the time that this event was happening? And you get context to it. You forget sometimes that when an event happened back in the early 1900s, there was no radio, there was no TV certainly, and there was no internet. And people 100 years from now will have to try to figure out what the context of our time period is. If they lump all of the 2000s together, we'll get a read of what was happening in our lives today. For instance, we're much different now in 2023 than we were in 2003. So just in 20 years, you know, Facebook didn't really come around for mainstream. It was a college thing, but social media didn't start coming around till the late 2000s and early 2010s. And think about how that's changed our world. So if we look back at a time period, putting things in context is really important. So just think about that. I'm going to try to do a better job about it, thinking about the nostalgic views. Because people ask me all the time, like, what's your favorite time period? And I often say that, what time period would you like to go back to, perhaps? And one of the time periods is the 20s, because you always think the roaring 20s, right? Well, it wasn't roaring for everybody. There was a lot of stuff going on. We were coming out of World War I. We were coming out of a pandemic, Spanish flu. Women had just gotten the right to vote, and there was tension about that. Remember, not everybody supported that. A big portion of the of the population, including women, didn't support women's right to vote. So we had that going on. And we had the resurgence, and John Meacham talks about this in the interview that he did, was the resurgence of the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan was around the 1800s, and it came back in the 1920s. And it was back here in Western New York, in East Aurora people, and we can talk about that maybe at another day in more detail. But we forget that during the Roaring 20s, the Ku Klux Klan was organized here in East Aurora in Western New York. They had meetings in Williamsville. So there was tension, and there was not all wonderful things happening. So the Roaring 20s was not roaring for everybody, and was not. There was a lot of political problems at that period of time. But because we're looking back in nostalgia, with the flappers and the dancers coming out of the war, people being happy, we miss all the other things that were happening at the same time. So thanks for joining me. Please keep the comments coming, and we'll see you next time. Again, just a note that I am the Town and Village Historian, but these videos and a lot of the writing I do are done separately, so anything I say or we talk about here is not connected officially with my job at the Town and the Village. Thanks again. Have a great time, and we'll see you next week.